Good afternoon, and welcome to today's module on the grammatical stage of formation with Laura Berquist. Laura, would you like to begin with a prayer, please?
Yes, thank you, Sue. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death. Amen.
Mother of divine grace,
Pray for us.
in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so we're going to talk now about the grammatical stage of formation, basically grades 3 through 5. I'm going to start out with an overview, and I just want to warn you, if you have just been listening to modules, I'm going to go over some things that I went over at the beginning of the K through second, and that I went over in the classical curriculum, and that you will find at the beginning of the analytic module. I always start with the overview. And that's because if you're listening to this in isolation, it's important at every stage to have that context. But if you're listening to them one after another or in close proximity, you might want to maybe skip ahead a little bit here. Okay, so that's just a warning. Um, our training objectives today are to identify the stages of formation in general, but then to understand the focus of this stage, the grammatical stage. We will review the books that are used at this level, and I'll talk a little bit about ways to adjust curriculum, kind of steps to take. The case studies are really an adjunct. That is, we're offering a case study for the grammatical, a case study time, questions and answers for the grammatical period, and you can find out about that from the office about when we offer it. I'll mention a little bit about those case studies when I get to the end. So here's an overview what we are intending to do. It is important to have an overview of our program. It's important, in fact, to have an overview of anything that you're doing. The beginning and the end of an activity have to be seen in any endeavor to have a real understanding of the process and the goals. You know, Aristotle says the end is the cause of causes. It is the final cause, that goal to which you are moving, the thing you want to bring about, that more than anything else is the cause of what you do. If you're making a cake, the most important cause is that you want the cake, right? That's why you do everything else that you do, so that you can get that end product. And it's true about every activity. It's the end that you're trying to achieve that most drives the process. So when our kids are in school, we need to have some vision of that end that we're trying to achieve, because it's what's driving the entire process of education. And it does make a difference. It makes a difference in what you do now. I'll just give a little example. If you know that we're going to be talking about types of government, we're going to talk about the importance of mixed government, that we have this eventual orientation to understanding the nature of government. If you know that, then in 7th grade, which we're not doing yet, but in 7th grade, when you get to the Shakespeare poem about, or selection from Henry V, about being a king and the difficulties of being a king and how all this responsibility rests on the shoulders of the king, you're going to recognize that this is important for that end, right? So where you might be tempted to skip over it, and we have to make judgments about things that we're going to do and not do, but you'll recognize the importance of that poem in the light of this later end that's going to be achieved. So that's just one example, but it's that kind of thing. Education, knowledge is always freeing. When you understand what you're trying to achieve and how that's being brought about, then you are in control of any changes that need to be made. You can make well-informed decisions for yourself and your children. You're a free man. Now, we want to talk, the context of our conversation about education is classical education. So I want to start with what classical education is. And this particular definition comes from the end to which classical education is ordered. So, classical education is the cultivation of wisdom and virtue by nourishing the soul on truth, goodness, and beauty, so that in Christ the student is better able to know, glorify, and enjoy God. So you see from that definition that the end to which we are moving, most of all, is to know God, right? Know, glorify, and enjoy God. That's the ordering principle more than anything else. We achieve that by cultivating wisdom and virtue, and by introducing our children, nourishing our children on truth, goodness, and beauty. But the wisdom, virtue, the truth, goodness, and beauty are ordered to knowing, glorifying, and enjoying God. Okay? Now, this involves many things. Some of them are here. It involves habits of mind. That is, you develop certain methods of thinking about things and habits of thinking. A habit becomes like a second nature. It's achieved by repeated action. Good habits are achieved by repeated right action. Every good habit is a virtue. Habits are, and you can have moral habits and you can have intellectual habits. Here we're talking about intellectual habits, and as I said, that can involve both the process whereby you investigate something, and it can also be the knowledge that you have that enables you to understand other pieces of knowledge. Both of those are habits of mind. They're intellectual virtues. So we're trying to build intellectual virtues in our children, right uses of the power of the intellect. So we want them to know how to approach a subject, what an argument is, how to investigate, what do you look at, like knowing that the four causes are going to tell you what you need to know about the being of something, its matter, its form, the agency by which it's brought about, and the end to which it's ordered. That's a habit of thought to utilize those. It's also a habit of thought to learn, just as an example, to learn Euclid's propositions, those geometrical propositions. That's an intellectual virtue. And it's useful, it's a good thing to know in itself, but it's also useful because, for example, St. Thomas uses the definition of equality that Euclid gives when he is talking about the Trinity, because it's explaining that it doesn't pertain. But you wouldn't know what he was talking about if you didn't have that earlier habit, that intellectual virtue. So we're developing both things in our children. It's habits of mind that make it easier for them to learn the truth. We're teaching them how to think, how to approach a subject. We're teaching them skills that enable them to learn new things well, and we're teaching them particular things that will make learning other things easier. Now, I always like to point this out. That's classical education. That's what it's about, those habits of mind, that learning how to think, how to approach a subject, intellectual virtue. That's what it's about. Now, I also want you to think about this. We are made in God's image and likeness. We are in his image and likeness because we can know and love, as he does. He knows and loves, right? So he made us with that capacity. So we're like him because we can exercise our intellect and our will. Now, we're more like him, we're more perfect in that image when we're actually knowing and loving. So the capacity to know and love is good, and it's in the image of God. But when you're actually knowing and loving, when you're exercising that power, then you are more perfectly in His image. And when you're exercising it with respect to Him, so you're knowing and loving Him, who is the highest object and requires the most requires all of your capacity to know and love, then you're most like Him. You're most like Him then. And so and that knowing and loving Him is ordered to heaven, right? To when we will see God face to face, when we will, as most perfectly as we can, know and love, right? And this is, remember that definition that I gave of classical education? It was that this education is ordered to knowing, glorifying, and enjoying God, right? That is also what we are ordered to by our lives, by our natures. So classical education has the same end identically as our end as men. And that is the knowledge of the very highest object of truth, God Himself. And as you know, love follows knowledge. You know, in the Baltimore Catechism, when it says, why did God make me? God made me to know, love, and serve Him in this world so that I can be happy with Him in the next. Notice knowledge comes first. Love follows on knowledge. So that's a goal of our lives, to know and love God as perfectly as we can, to be as much in His image, as conformed to Him as it is possible for us to be. And that's the goal of classical education. So amazing, right? That's amazing. And shows you how important this kind of education is. Now, there's another way to look at this kind of education, classical education, in terms of the subjects that are taught, which are formative, right? They're part of this habit of thought. So we start out with, you're looking at this slide here on the screen, you start out with the liberal arts, the arts of the quadrivium and the trivium. The trivium is grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium is arithmetic, astronomy, music, and geometry. That's not usually the order in which they're put, but those are the arts. Arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. That's how it's usually put, okay? Those arts are ordered to the sciences, to knowing the things that are universal and unchanging, that are completely immaterial. You don't make them in any way. You discover them. You come to know them. The arts, the trivium and the quadrivium, consist of things that you make in some way. Not the way you make a painting, though there's a similarity, or the way you make a building. But there is a product that is made, which exists in the maker. In the sciences, in the things we know, we don't make them. They're not measured by us. We're measured by them. And then the sciences, you know, knowing like the study of nature, the physics, or the Dhanama, the study of the soul, or the study of the ethics and the politics, those kinds of sciences, that's ordered to knowing metaphysics, those things that are the foundation of all knowing. And that is sometimes called natural theology, because metaphysics, which deals with the fundamental things that are known and the fundamental causes of what is, the most fundamental cause of what is God, right? The first cause. So Aristotle was a pagan. He didn't have revelation. There are a lot of things he didn't know. But using his reason, he knew that there was a first cause that was immaterial. It was a thought thinking itself, and it was responsible for the being of everything else. He got that by reason. And that's why metaphysics is sometimes called natural theology, because it gets you to that first cause. But all of that is ordered to sacred theology. It's all ordered to knowing God in a manner of speaking, in the way he knows himself, right? Because he's revealing it. The scripture is his word, and the church speaks for him. Sacred theology concerns what God has revealed to us about himself and his plan for salvation, and about the other immaterial beings like the angels. So that's the schema of classical education. St. Thomas lays this out in question 5 of the commentary on Boethius' De Trinitate. Aristotle didn't have the sacred theology piece, but this follows his recommendation for learning. It makes sense in terms of the natures of things. So that's classical education. It consists of the liberal arts, sciences to which they're ordered, metaphysics, and then sacred theology. Now, and in sacred theology, just let me explain why we use the word wisdom. To be wise is to see in terms of the causes. That's what it means to be wise. And in sacred theology, you are learning about reality through the first cause, like in the first cause. So in a way, the goal is to see as God sees. That's why we call it wisdom. Okay, now we are not with our 3rd through 5th graders going to be reading the metaphysics. I mean, in order to do that well, you have to have developed many habits of thought, many intellectual virtues, many processes, and much knowledge. But everything has a foundation, and what we're doing is all of those disciplines, those arts and sciences, but we're doing them in the way that's appropriate to the stage of formation of the student. I think that, at this point it's important to say that all learning is cyclical. All learning is cyclical. We learn first on an introductory level, and then we come back to the same objects at a deeper level. I generally use this mathematics as an example of that, because once you have mastered counting, you start working on learning to add, subtract, multiply, and divide, those operations. And then you use those operations first with respect to the whole numbers, but then you use those operations with respect to fractions, and then decimals, right? You add, subtract, multiply, and divide decimals, and then percents. And then you use those operations in algebraic expressions, in trigonometric functions, in calculus, in quantum physics. There's a very real way in which all of mathematics is a deepening of your understanding of those 4 operations. And you see this in other areas as well. It's true in every field. It's true in every discipline. I think we're all aware of how true it is in, say, our study of Scripture. Our kindergartners read the Bible for the first time, a retelling of the Bible. The kids go on being introduced over the years to various parts of Scripture in 6th grade in our program. They read Mark and Luke. They read Acts of the Apostles in 7th grade. In 11th grade, they read through fundamentally the entire Scripture. And then, my hope is that as adults, they'll continue to read the Scriptures. The church presents the Scriptures to us every Sunday, every day we go to Mass. Right? And it's because your whole life you will spend deepening your understanding of what you first understand on only a very simple level. So, and I think most of us at least have that experience with Scripture. You hear something you've heard, 100 times before, and all of a sudden you think, whoa, I never thought about it that way before. That is so interesting, right? It happens frequently. It's true in other areas, too. And because that's true, what our young children do, our kindergartners through 5th graders, what they're doing, if we're aware of that you learn something first on a simple level and then you deepen your understanding. If you're aware of that, then you structure the lessons in such a way that they're going to be presented with truths that they will come back to later and think about in a deeper way. And that's built into our program. So that's a good thing to know in this overview. In the very earliest years, we are helping our students strengthen and make docile their imagination by exercises in observation, memorization, and sequential ordering. We do that, we use those methods with a matter that also prepares the mind and heart for the later deep truths. At that earlier level, at that earlier level, they're making their acquaintance with salvation histories, something they will study all their lives. They're introduced to the good and the beautiful in many areas as a preparation for the true. They learn the basis of all arithmetic. They develop an acquaintance with geometric figures. They're exposed to great music, and they study God's effects in nature. In other words, the arts of the quadrivium, the foundation for that. They learn the basis of all language arts, reading and writing, which constitutes a beginning of the trivium. And this slide on the screen is addressed to that, to the trivium. As the student matures, he continues to perfect these methods and subjects. He keeps coming back to them at a deeper level. So the trivium, as I said earlier, is about the arts of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. These all have to do with speech in some way. So grammar is concerned with the construction of a sentence, and its principles are ways of signifying that determine the parts of speech. So grammar is concerned with the construction of a sentence, and its principles are ways of signifying that determine the parts of speech. Logic concerns method of procedure in all the sciences, principally definition and reasoning, which are carried on through speech. Rhetoric is the art of speaking persuasively. And in all of these, there's a sort of making. One makes a statement, an argument, and a speech. That's the product that I talked about earlier. Now, these are the first connections with the arts that lead to the sciences, that lead to natural and sacred theology. They're foundational, the things that we do that in language arts preparation. And additionally, as the students get older, we work on argumentation so that they can eventually use rhetoric in the service of the truly noble. We teach our students to summarize, so to order items according to importance instead of chronology. We teach them to identify an argument and then construct their own arguments. We teach them to develop their thoughts in paragraphs so that they can later develop them in essays, papers, and speeches. So we're working always towards something. Everything we do on the foundational level has in mind the later skill to which this skill is ordered. Now, with our older children, we explicitly introduce the ends of rhetoric into their regular assignments. So, we saw this slide earlier, but it wasn't where it was supposed to be. So now we're at the right place for this slide. Okay, so sorry about that. Rhetoric is of three kinds: the political, the forensic, and the ceremonial. The political aims at establishing whether a proposed course of action is expedient or inexpedient, like if it's going to work or not. The forensic has to do with whether an action was just or unjust, and then the ceremonial has to do with whether someone deserves praise or blame. And our high school program, every assignment is framed around one or more of these three ends of rhetoric, because I've just found that high school students care passionately about this. And this is a very real preparation for and actual participation in the art of rhetoric. Now, that's okay, Sue. I know. Okay, so now we also prepare for the sciences. We introduce our children to great literature, and through these works, the student gains a sort of experience. You can't do philosophy without experience. You have to have experience. That's why, you know, some people think that in order to do philosophy, all you need to do is read it. But reading it isn't enough. You have to bring to the text certain other habits of thought. So, like Plato's dialogues, reading good literature and good history prepares the student for reading Plato's dialogues well. Now, I've never met a mom who didn't understand the problem that's enunciated in the Meno, which is whether virtue can be taught. We thought about that. We have experience. We've tried to teach virtue to our children. It's been on our minds. So what Plato is teaching in that dialogue is very relevant and understandable to us. But most kids don't have that experience. And because of that, they can't read it well. Similarly with the Gorgias, where there's this beautiful line in the Gorgias where Gorgias says he's a free man because he does what he feels like doing. And Socrates says, oh, you mean you're a slave to your passions? Okay, I get that, right? I've had that experience. I've watched. I see that when somebody, just does what they feel like doing, they're not really doing what they want to do. They're being driven by their passion. Kids don't get that either. So the idea here is that we want to prepare our students to read philosophy, to read those sciences that I talked about earlier well. And in order to do that, they have to gain a sort of experience. Great works of literature appeal to the imagination, move the affections rightly, give the student the experience without having them have to suffer the consequences. And similarly, the great works of history provide vicarious moral experience, as well as an introduction to human society and, encouraging a sense of what the common good is and an awareness of the great issues that mankind faces. All of that vicarious experience learned from great literature and great works of history prepares the student to read those dialogues on the ethics and politics of Aristotle at the right time. We also, in our program with our high school students, do introduce the students to what our founding fathers had to say regarding the nature of the republic and the particular incarnation of the form of mixed government that was appropriate to us in this new land, the United States. And when I do the module on the high school program, I will talk about that in much more detail. We approach that over a 4-year period of high school, setting up the question, giving the kids the information, the content, those intellectual virtues that they need to understand the later things, also helping them work through, develop those habits of approach that make it possible for them to develop the argument. That's all worked into the curriculum. We're developing those habits of thought. And this, with respect to the study of government, that's really the beginning of the study of politics. We also, we have this natural science class that the kids do in 10th grade. And it's an interesting thing in itself, but it is really intentionally ordered to the de anima. It's giving the children what they need to begin that study well. Because, as Aristotle explains, you can't directly see the soul. You can't know about the soul just by looking at it. You have to know it by its effects. And then he lays out the steps. We follow those steps in the natural science program. So all of that is intentionally worked into the curriculum. This is classical education, but it's the beginning, it's the foundation, and it's ordered to what the children will do later. It's ordered by intention, It's ordered by developing particular habits of thought. So, as regards the highest object of the classical curriculum, God himself, the end of natural and supernatural theology, we prepare our children for that knowledge from the moment they are born. And we do that by the way we live, by the example we give them of fatherhood and of sacrificial love, and by the doctrine we teach them as soon as they are able to reason. And all of this is their first introduction to the greatest truths, to the object that they will, with God's grace, contemplate in eternity, which is so wonderful to think about. Now, I am fond of saying this, so you hear me say it frequently, but it is true that all men think. That's true. By nature, we think. But you know, thinking can be done well or badly, and one can be taught to do it well. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help children think well. We're trying to develop those habits of thought. We're trying to give them the tools that they need and also the intellectual virtues, the specific content that builds, right? And in large measure, I think that the role of the grade school and high school teacher is to teach children to think well. To do that, however, you have to be familiar with how thinking takes place in the human person. So what I'm about to talk about comes from the De Anima of Aristotle, book 3, and it comes from a remarkably complex, interesting series of considerations. And I'm just going to summarize the conclusions, so I know I'm not doing justice. But I think even the summary can be helpful to you as a teacher, as if you know how learning takes place, how people come to understanding, then you're going to be better able to identify what needs to be worked on in your house with this child. Okay? So we'll start out. You first receive the form of external objects by means of your 5 senses. So you see, hear, smell, taste, or touch the objects around you, and/or, right? Maybe all of those things, or at least some of them. That information, which is a reception of the form of the thing you are knowing, that information is received by one or more of the 5 proper senses and then passed on to what Aristotle calls the common sense. He reasons to the existence of the common sense because he sees that none of the proper senses can integrate the information. You can see that the thing on the table is white, and your tongue can tell that it's sweet or salty, right? But your eye can't tell that. Your eye can't detect sweetness or saltiness. And yet you know that it's the same thing that is both white and either sweet or salty, right? So someplace in you that information is integrated. Aristotle saw that. He named the place of integration the common sense, that is, the place that was common to all the senses. And he just reasoned that that had to be the case. Then, just as the proper senses receive from the external object and the common sense receives from the proper senses, the imagination receives this integrated form from the common sense. But this power, the imagination, is different because it retains what it has received. Unlike the proper sense and the common sense, which only have those forms in them when they're actually exercising their power. So I only see it when I'm seeing it, right? Once I close my eyes or I move the object away, I no longer see it. But I can remember it and I can recall it. And that's because the power of the imagination, what we call the brain, is that power is able to retain and recall, which is big. Now, Aristotle compares this power of the imagination to a wax slate. The forms which come from the senses are like seals, he says, pressed into wax. And because of that, so that's a great image. And it explains a lot. Because sometimes wax is hard and you have to press it. You have to press the seal a lot and repeatedly in order for the impression to be made, right? Sometimes the wax is too soft and it makes an impression, but then the impression, you lose it because it mushes. Sometimes the wax is in exactly the right condition. You press the seal into the wax and you're left with a beautiful, clear, sharp image that's faithful to the original. That's when it's working as it ought, right? So it seems reasonable to say that it's best if the imagination receives that seal, receives the image in such a way that it's clear, crisp, faithful to the original, like that, right? Then it's doing well what it is intended by nature to do. Once the form has been received into the imagination, what happens is another power of the soul comes into play, the power that resides in the imagination, and it's called the vis cogitativa, or thinking power. And the function of this power is to sort these objects into like kinds. So, you put all the chairs together in one place, you put all the trees together in one place, like that. Sort the things into their like kinds. I think of it in terms of this sort of a little sorting block that the kids use, because it's important to see about this power that it's not making universal consideration. It's not, identifying what makes a star and then seeing that these are both stars and putting them together. All you need to do in order to use this little box is to see that there's a likeness. I pick up that star-shaped block and I say, oh, look, there's a shape over here like that, and you stick it in. You just see a likeness. That's all that the baby has to do. No universal knowledge, just dealing with the particular in front of it, just sorting. So that happens, and it's important to be clear about that, because it's only after you have sorted these things into like kinds that the mind, the active power of the mind, which we call the agent intellect, can act on those collected like things. And what it does, it shines its light, so to speak, and abstracts the it abstracts what is common to all of those like things, their nature or their essence. It sees in its light what is the same, what's universal about all of them, draws that out, so to speak, abstracts it, and then that is received into the possible intellect. And that's how we come to know whatever we know. We know what chairness is because we've received that universal nature of chair. Okay? So the reason I think it's so important to go through this is because as educators, we're concerned about perfecting whatever we can of every part of this process of thinking. There's not a whole lot you can do about how the common sense works, or the proper senses. Like if somebody can't see well, you can get glasses. If they can't hear well, you can get a hearing aid. If they're not able to integrate information well, there are some things you can do. You can use Fast Forward, which is a program designed to help students integrate sensory input, which is what the common sense does, but it's hard. However, the function of the imagination, that right condition, the receptiveness of the imagination, which you saw was really crucial, right? That image has to be received into the imagination, in such a way that it's a really good image, a good instance of that form, as it were, and in order for the agent intellect to be able to abstract the nature from it. And so there's a lot we can do to help the imagination be in the proper condition to receive the image as well. All of the observations, sequencing, memorization activities that we do in kindergarten through 5th grade are ordered to improving the receptivity of the imagination and its ability to recall information as needed. We're trying to strengthen and make docile the imagination. We also want the kids to learn the particular pieces of information, but we know that those activities of memorizing, observing attentively, putting things in order, we know that those activities do exercise the imagination, and that makes the imagination stronger and more docile. And so that's something that, every educator should pay attention to. And we work with this training of the imagination in every level of our program. In these early years, which we're talking about today, the grammatical stage, it's very apparent because there's memory work or observations or sequencing in virtually every assignment. So you can see, we're working on training the imagination. But even in the analytical stage, you have the help of a trained imagination if you've been doing those exercises in the early years. But you are also exercising that ability as you summarize or analyze or recognize an argument. And in exercising that ability, you're strengthening it. Every time you exercise a power, you strengthen it. So we're both utilizing the trained imagination, but we're also continuing to strengthen the imagination. And that is true in the rhetorical stage as well, where the goal is to articulate arguments eloquently, present polished positions coherently and accurately, and to and to exercise that ability. So I think so I want you to see why it's important to be thinking about training the imagination. Now, this training has to do with methodological goals. We do it in this way to develop those skills. There's also the content goals, which I was talking about earlier. We're doing the beginning of the arts and sciences, right? So my goal is that you see that both of these things are important. What you do is important, and it develops a particular habit of thought, an intellectual virtue. But how you do it is also important and is also a habit of thought. That's what I want you to see. So, as I said at the very beginning, one needs to see the beginning and end to understand the process. We begin with laying the foundation of the tools of thinking, the training of the imagination, sequencing, memorization, and observation. Then we provide training in writing skills, thinking skills, and the mathematical progression. So, I'm going to talk about this more in subsequent workshops. These skills are used with specific content. In terms of our high school program, I want every student to know the motives of credibility, that argument that starts with showing that God exists by reason. Aristotle did it, we can do it. And moving from that to the Catholic Church is the true church. We do that explicitly. We prepare for that in 9th grade. We do it explicitly in 10th grade. We look at one part of that argument in detail in 11th grade, and we do it again explicitly in 12th grade. I think it's very important. And then we talk about the virtue of a mixed government, what a mixed government is, how it can be, there are different versions of mixed government. And my goal was to develop a central argument over a long period of time because it's a way to develop in children the habit of thought that keeps something in mind for a long time and moves to the next step, right? I wanted to do that. I picked motives of credibility because that's obvious. It's central. It's about the faith. It's a supernatural end. I picked the virtue of a mixed government because we live in a time when people really need to know what a good government is. And, our children will be called on to make decisions and to be leaders. And I thought it was an important place for them to achieve a certain level of knowledge and a good place to develop a four-year argument. And then we also are concerned, especially in the sciences and math, and development of the notion of what a one is. When do you have a one, a unit, something singular? When do you have a new one? And how do you know? What's a substance? And that's because though they consider those ideas in the sciences and in math, it becomes really central when they get to philosophy and theology. So there you go. That's kind of an overview of the program. Now we'd like to look at third grade in particular. Now, I've already mentioned this, but I'm going to say it explicitly here. Every assignment, every single assignment in our program has an immediate methodological goal. At this level, it will be, observing, memorizing, sequencing, paying attention to patterns of language. Those are specific skills that we're working on that are developing habits of thought. There's also going to be a specific content, whatever it is. So learning to read, or learning to parse, or learning, there's a specific content that's appropriate. Yeah. And we talk about those specific content goals in our scope and sequence charts and in our text used and reasons why charts. We are continuing at this level. Well, so I want to say this. So on that picture that we were looking at, there was a particular, immediate methodological goal and a particular, thanks, Sue, content goal. And then those are ordered by intention to a later methodological goal and a later content goal. And so you want to be thinking about that in some measure when you're working on the assignments. So, The method, like I said, at this level is to use observation, sequencing, and memorization to improve the power of making images and the quality of the images made. We also do add developing patterns of language, when we do that by using copying, dictation, conversation, usage exercises, and creative writing. Okay, that's what this slide is about. All of these are writing activities, all of them, and each of them is important. Right, there are the patterns of language: copying, dictation, conversation, usage exercises, and creative writing, which are writing activities. Then we have specific content goals, which that's what's found in the scope and sequence charts and the text use and reasons why. There we go. Now, we're continuing to work at this level on improving the strength and docility of the imagination. We're working on developing the tools of expression so that the imagination has furniture to be arranged when the student is ready. During this period, he should be focusing on acquiring information that will be categorized later. So analytic grammar becomes essential in 6th through 9th grade, but in 3rd through 5th grade, what we're doing is developing familiarity with the patterns of language so that the 6th through 9th grade student can analyze those patterns. Children at this stage of formation should develop a love of reading and a love of stories, so that in the analytic stage they will be able to analyze what they read or have read easily. We're preparing for that next step. They should become familiar with the 4 basic operations in math so that in the analytic stage they can move on to pre-algebra and algebra, use them elsewhere, right? These are contents that are ordered one to the other. The later formation to which this is ordered is the ability to order our thoughts, to recognize and produce a reasoned argument, and to present a cohesive argument. Now, the later knowledge to which the content is ordered is in many cases obvious, as in math, where so recognizing numbers eventually leads to calculus, right? Or English, where learning to read eventually leads to an ability to read Shakespeare or St. Thomas. But there are those major content goals that I've already talked about, the motives of credibility, and the understanding of government, and that sense of oneness to which this is, in a way, all ordered. So the classical method of education accomplishes various goals. It trains the mind, it gathers information for use in later years, and does that by incorporating the student's natural abilities and inclinations. As I said, all men think, but thinking can be done well or badly, and one can be taught to do it well. We're working on that explicitly in our program by training our children to use the tools of thinking well, particularly the imagination. We also are developing those intellectual virtues or habits of thought whereby we teach a content that is going to be built upon later. So that, circular manner that I was talking about, where you keep coming back to consider these truths. So we do investigate every one of the liberal arts, the sciences, natural and sacred theology. But we're doing it on the level and in the way that fits the student's natural abilities and inclinations for each stage of formation. Okay, so let's take a closer look at third grade. Up to this point, there's a way in which the content has basically been about learning to read and write, not only, but basically. Now, in this next stage of formation, which we're referring to as the grammatical stage, which is, third or fourth grade through about sixth grade, fifth or sixth, the subjects that we're studying, provide that foundation that we're going to build on, but we continue to have a strong emphasis on observation, on memorization, on sequencing, in other words, on using the imagination well, perfecting its power. This approach trains the mind and gathers knowledge to use in the later years, and it uses the student's natural abilities and inclinations. In third grade, there's a strong emphasis on memorization. The student memorizes catechism questions and answers, math facts, poetry, history dates, science facts, phonograms, and Latin vocabulary. All of those. There's a lot of memory work. I found that it's a particularly good time to incorporate memory work. The kids they have a strong ability, they enjoy it, they can get a lot of useful memory facts down. Okay, we're going to look briefly at the specific texts we use in third grade and why, but I have a few things I always like to go over first. So the Bible stories are ordered to the understanding of creation, man made in God's image and likeness, to original sin, the preternatural gifts, sanctifying grace, God's omnipotence and providence. And all of these concepts are going to come up in high school and college. So you notice that circular manner of learning. We're laying the foundation now. My own view is that the language of the text should stretch the child if possible, because we want him to develop an ear for various patterns of language. The text we use here is the Bishop Knecht book. It's really not that hard, but the language is a little archaic. I embrace that. I think it's good. I'm glad my kids read it. I think it's good for them to see that there are different ways of saying something, and that if you compare a very simple sentence to a more complex sentence saying the same thing, you'll find that you learn more from the complex sentence, generally speaking. The method of religion courses in these earlier years is also ordered, I just want to mention this to you, peripherally, I understand, but nonetheless really to helping children understand the hypostatic union when the time comes. So anytime in the curriculum when there's an opportunity to do the same thing in different modes, I take it, because I want my children to see that you can learn or understand the same thing in different ways. Jesus knew everything. He's God. He knows everything, but he still learned. I want the children to have an experience to draw on when they encounter that concept. And, choosing one visual image to stand for the whole of a narration, as we do in the religion course, is an analytic activity. So it's preparing the student for the next intellectual stage. The main reason we highly recommend using primary language lessons for our English is because it's a great text for practicing those, so to speak, pre-grammar skills of copying, dictation, conversation, usage exercises, and creative writing. All of these skills are highly formative. Our goal is to produce in our children the ability to think and learn and to express or articulate what they are thinking about, what they have learned. Primary language lessons by using copying, which is a form of imitation, dictation, where you move in the other direction from what is heard to what is written, observation, where you are exercising the imagination in that particular way, and then a conversation about what you're observing. So you learn to articulate in the third person as about something outside yourself. And then the usage exercises and the creative writing. All of that is highly formative to the power of articulation. I want to make a note about phonics here. We continue to use phonics from kindergarten all the way through 6th grade. And that's because, first you're using it to learn to read, but later you're using it to understand language structure. I think this is a good thing in itself, and it also provides an occasion of having the experience of seeing that something that originally looks chaotic is in fact highly ordered but complex. And that's an important experience to have. It's a preparation for life, because life is like that, right? It can look chaotic, but it's not chaotic. It's all in God's providence. It's highly ordered. I think that it's a good thing to have that experience on another level. Additionally, we use phonics to study the structure of the language, which is important. And as I've mentioned at other times in other places, phonics has been over and over again shown to be foundational with respect to helping children become fluent readers, good spellers, and knowledgeable about their language. I do want to mention the importance of copying, because I used to think that it was a waste of time, so I always like to point out to the moms I'm working with that it's anything but a waste of time. Children learn naturally by imitation, so it's utilizing something that's natural to them, natural way of learning. Copying is good for hand-eye coordination. That's really huge. When the children are copying, they have the opportunities to see their own composition in their own handwriting with correct punctuation, capitalization, and spelling. And when they're copying, they pay close attention to and think about which words are capitalized and where the punctuation marks are placed. But when they're copying, like with the religion, we have the children retell the story. Mom writes it down. Then the children copy it. You're separating the composition from the physical act of writing. And that's a good thing, because they can often compose on a level they're not yet able to write at, certainly not at the speed needed. So you want to, I just want to encourage you to actually utilize the copying that's in the program. In terms of writing, we have these lovely rating rubrics charts that are in the resource section of your syllabus. I really encourage you to become familiar with those. In 3rd grade, you'll see that there's a focus in the writing skills on word use, as as part of our writing program. And you'll notice we don't have a separate writing program. Our writing program is integrated into the other subjects, which is one of the reasons why you really kind of need to pay attention to the particular instructions in the syllabus. So, because those instructions, when followed, will produce somebody who really knows how to write well. There isn't a separate writing course. Okay? So in 3rd grade, we're hoping to begin to draw children's attention to using colorful and descriptive words. So when they're retelling, that they won't just simply repeat the words from the original story, but that he will choose words that are vivid and, really draw a picture and also reveal his own personality. And then you'll also notice on that writing chart that in 3rd grade we recommend that students, that we notice that they have a complete thought, a subject and a verb, and working on proper end punctuation. In science and art, the students are encouraged to apply their observational skills, and their memory. So keep that in mind when you're doing the science and art. And I like to just say this to people. We homeschool so that we can form our children. It's important, I found, to schedule one-on-one time in third grade. Really, it would be best every day, where you review the work that the student's having trouble with, if there is any, or just do the things together. Like I always did religion with my children. I always did religion. They didn't just go off and do it. Maybe they'd go and read something, but then we would talk about it. I scheduled one-on-one time for religion, and I generally worked on grammar and Latin one-on-one with my kids. And so I found that they did a lot better if I did that. It also just gave me a place to have real conversation with them. I had them at home so that we could talk heart to heart. And if you're just sending somebody away to do their work, you're missing out on an opportunity. And having conversations about your schoolwork, like catechism questions and answers, or discussion about the book he's reading, is important for the child in terms of developing communication skills, and it also is your very best form of assessment. Find out what he knows and how well he knows it. So I recommend it. Schedule time with the individual children. Okay, so let's look at the texts themselves here. Let's see. I love the Baltimore Catechism. Baltimore Catechism is distilled St. Thomas. It actually improves the student's ability to think because it gives them a precise vocabulary, which, is one of the tools of thinking. And it's really a model of cogent thought. One time I was teaching CCD, and I was using the Catechism, or PRI, or whatever they call it these days. I was using the Catechism. It was on the sacraments. And my husband was preparing a presentation for parish class about the sacraments. So we were going over it together, and I was so impressed because the Baltimore Catechism contains the same doctrine as St. Thomas. So you can see that it fulfills perfectly that thing I was saying earlier about, you think about it first on a simpler level and then you come back at a deeper level. That's what's going on there. The Baltimore Catechism is a really good foundation. I've already talked about the Bible history. It's the Bishop Neck Bible history. I like it. The selection's so short. The vocabulary and the more archaic style is a little difficult, which is good. It stretches the student a little bit, but not beyond what most of them are capable of. So what I find is that the children's their ears adjust, and their patterns of language are expanded. We also, that doesn't say so here, but we also have the kids construct a 10 Commandments book, which provides an opportunity to use all the modalities of learning because he says the commandments, he writes the commandments, he illustrates the commandments, and he thinks about the way each commandment applies to his life. Okay, let's see. The third grader Becca arithmetic, it's kind of a hard book for some of the kids, so you want to be sure that the children are already know their multiplication tables. I counsel my families to work on the multiplication tables at the beginning of the year if they're not already down, because it will make doing this book so much easier. It moves pretty fast through those tables. But if you've got the multiplication tables, then this is a nice text because it, again, doesn't involve too much teacher time. It covers all the concepts. It's cyclical in nature. Once you learn a concept, you'll keep going back to it. And like I said, if you have your math facts down, then the individual lessons can be done pretty quickly. I talked about primary language lessons. We have moved to Writing Road to Reading from Sound Beginnings. In second grade, the primary recommendation is Sound Beginnings. Now we use Writing Road to Reading, which is the template from which Sound Beginnings was drawn. Writing Road to Reading is just a powerful text. It can be used in so many ways. It can teach reading, it can teach phonics, it can teach language structure, it can be used to remediate adults. It's a powerful spelling tool. Because it can do all those things, it's really good, but it can be intimidating for the first-time user. And that's why we recommend Mary McAllister starting a spelling notebook. She wrote that to help families that she was working with who are having trouble with writing road to reading. She thought the text was excellent and she didn't want them to abandon it. So she came up with these helps. And we do also offer for enrolled families a class in using Writing Road to Reading, which I highly recommend to my families. I want to mention one other thing about Writing Road. Though it generally employs the methodology of the grammatical stage of formation, there is an analytic component, which is nice because it's at the child's level. It's preparing him gently to move into that next stage of formation, which we really focus on in 6th grade. And I think that's important because when I say to you, we think that the right method for kindergarten through 5th grade is memorization, observation, sequencing, thinking about patterns of language, that thing. We're not saying nobody analyzes. That would be silly. Children analyze. What we are saying is that analysis isn't what they do all the time, everywhere, with everything. What they do naturally in these early years is memorize, observe, and sequence. But having some analysis is good as a preparation for what's coming up later. And primary language lessons also contains the appropriate elements for this kind of language development. So I think language arts. Poetry, the poems in 3rd grade are chosen primarily because of their literary merit. They're likely to come up again in the children's experience. And so lots of them anyway, refer to literature or will be referred to in literature that the student will read for the rest of his life. In Latin for 3rd grade, we recommend either English from the roots up, which is just learning some Greek and Roman roots, and so basically some vocabulary, or our Beginning Latin 1 program, the Mother of Divine Grace Beginning Latin 1 program, which I do highly recommend. I used it with my 3rd grade grandchild, and we found it to be very doable. But either way, doing some kind of word study, vocabulary, foreign language is a really good idea. And there are those 2 possibilities. Thanks, Sue. Okay, in science, we use the Abeka Exploring God's World. It's a very pleasant text written at a 3rd grade level and encourages the student's sense of wonder. In history, we offer 2 possibilities: How Our Nation Began or Our American Heritage. How Our Nation Began is a Father Furlong book. It's Catholic. Our American Heritage is an Abeka book. The thing the reason we offer both of them is because Our American Heritage is personality driven, and I find that works really well for 3rd graders, whereas Our Nation Began is event driven, and I find that doesn't usually capture their attention in the same way. 4th grade it does, but in 3rd grade I just have seen that the personalities speak more to them. You can use either one. Eventually we are going to have our own Catholic personality driven study of history, because that's what I would really like to have. And now we have some experience in publishing. At the moment, though, you have to think about which of these 2 texts you would prefer. Both of them are appropriate to the student, but I especially like the Our American Heritage approach. And in either case, there are numerous supplemental books suggested which will help bring early American history to life. The geography, we use a map study skills that goes along with that study of early American history, and the kids are learning their states and capitals, which is really fun. I remember when one of my, I guess it was my youngest son, somebody called up and was saying, oh, the states and capitals just takes too long. And I spent some time talking to the mom about what she could do, but I went away from the phone and said to my son, I want you to do the states and capitals as fast as you can. Not crazy, but just one after another, no pauses, no conversation, just do it. I'm going to time you. And it took him less than 2.5 minutes to go through all 50, identifying the state and capital. So that's kind of fun to get that kind of mastery of it. In the art, we're using child-size masterpieces, which, yeah, is a great concept. They're getting harder and harder to find. I just have to be honest. But it's a great concept because the goals of close observation and memorization are really easily achieved using that matter. And the pictures are nice. And if you're actually using those cards, the child-sized masterpieces, they're sturdy enough to last through the year, which is a good thing. Okay, and with music, Let's Learn Music 2 is just a nice little theory book. If your kids are taking some kind of instrument, they don't need to do that. But if they're not, this gives them an introduction to basic music theory. And Music Masters is a very nice collection of classical music pieces. A lot of the moms I work with now aren't buying CDs. What they do is they just go look up those pieces on YouTube and listen to them there. That's fine. Okay, let's look at 4th grade here. The emphasis in 4th grade continues to be on the observation, memorizing, and sequencing, but we're now really working on that patterns of language, and we work on it by really focusing on copying, dictation, conversation, usage exercises, and creative writing. So, it continues to be important to do the memory work, but there's a real emphasis on the patterns of language. Okay. I say over and over in my language arts course, which I do recommend to you and is available to families. The training in writing starts with activities that don't immediately involve writing. You can't write unless you have something to say, and you can't write well unless you have a good, precise vocabulary and a broad familiarity with various patterns of language. So this year, important writing activities include reading aloud, sustained silent reading, and paying attention to the patterns of language. We're also going to be paying attention to the quality of the student's copying and his handwriting, as well as the accuracy of his retellings and his word usage. We consider when evaluating assignments whether the lines are straight, with all the letters formed properly and appropriate size and spacing. We also look for grammatically correct sentences with proper use of commas, and we introduce quotation marks along with, good spelling, right? Writing is assigned in history and religion assignments where students can write short retellings of what they read. Usually in 4th grade they can write them directly. Sometimes they start out the year still copying those, but by the end of the year they can usually just write their own retelling. Okay, we're going to look again at those specific texts, but first I have these few things to say. Phonics continues to be important, not for reading, but for spelling and language study. So I encourage people to keep doing phonics, even though the children are now fluent readers. The poetry in 4th grade is chosen to complement the history reading. So we've moved away from, familiar at-home kind of poems to poems having to do with the beginning of our country. Those Stephen Vincent Benet poems, for example, about George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, they're really fun. One more note about reading. Try to set aside a few minutes every week to have your student read aloud to you. Reading aloud is a different skill than silent reading and requires use of different areas of the brain. Even the best silent readers may stumble when reading aloud unless they practice. There is quite a lot of supplementary reading included in the history course in 4th grade. The student should have an hour, it's my opinion, okay, but I suggest that the students have an hour of directed reading every day. This can provide time for leisure reading, but history reading should take precedence. The exact amount of additional reading is up to your discretion. So, I've had kids who were great readers and they could read all their history stuff in a short time. And so then during their directed reading time, what I chose for them, usually I give the kids a choice of, 10 books. And for an hour, they were supposed to read something from one of those books. If they're good readers, then that directed reading time can be literature, other than history literature. But if they're not such good readers, then you don't want to overwhelm somebody, so then I recommend using that time for history reading. It is important to set aside time, as I was talking about in third grade, as a meeting time to discuss the students' reading assignments, especially now because they have a lot of things that they're reading. So give him an opportunity to express his thoughts. It's nice if you've read the books too and they're not so long, so it's more possible. But if you haven't, let him tell you about them. Really discuss it with him. And that allows you to ask questions and get a better grasp of the student's understanding of the material. When you have your time together, you can also have him recite his poem. He can practice troublesome flashcards. He can review any math concepts with which he is struggling. This time together is very formative, and we want to make it an important part of the day. I say to my busy moms, right? You have a lot of kids and it's hard to get everybody in. But I say step back, look at the overall picture. Our goal is to raise children who know how to think and communicate well and who have our values. Conversation is the best way to accomplish this. Okay, the art this year is ordered to close observation and the beginning of analysis. The student tries to draw from memory. It's so much fun. A painting he has closely observed. He also separates paintings according to schools of art. In science, the student constructs a bird book, drawing various birds and writing about them. The kids always love that. This all encourages observation, memorization, and an interest in God's creation. Now, I want to say that it's my opinion that every year should have some material that is easy for a student, so it gives him confidence. Most, that's at his comfort level, just right where he is, it sort of doesn't get in the way, But there should be some that's a challenge. The challenge pieces broaden his horizons and give him a clearer perception of reality. No one is comfortable in a reality of which he is the measure. I bring that up with respect to the religion text, Father Schuster's text. It's a challenging text. I acknowledge that. But the exposure now to this more complex pattern of language enables the students later on to read wonderful material like Shakespeare, Austen, and St. Thomas. Okay, so let's look at the particular texts here. Baltimore Catechism, I'd say the same things I said when we were talking about the third grade. It's wonderful. I love it. And it's such a good foundation for knowing your faith. I just talked about the Bible history using the Father Schuster text. I think it's excellent, but it can be challenging, and I note that. In math, we usually move to the Saxon 5-4, the majority of our families do, and it's actually a bit easier in its format and even in the problems at the beginning than the Abeka 3. So if somebody has struggled at all in the Abeka 3, this is nice. It will give them more confidence. It'll review concepts. It does eventually get to concepts about fractions that they have not yet been introduced to. So it does take them further, but it's a gentle review at the beginning. So that can be nice. Intermediate language lessons is like primary language lessons. It has exercises in copying, dictation, conversation, usage exercises, and creative writing. I used to, long ago, I knew that those 5 things were very important. So I would have the moms get different materials to, so we'd use learning language arts for copying and dictation. We'd use the art pictures for the observation conversation. We'd use Voyages in English for usage exercises, and then we would use a variety of things for the creative writing. And then one of my moms that I work with said, well, I'll do all of that. I'll get all those materials. I can do it. But I wish you'd look at this book because it seems to me this book is doing all of that. And sure enough, it was. Clearly, Emma Searle and I are on the same page because she has all 5 of those things just interspersed throughout the text. That's why we use it. Let's see. I've already talked about writing retreat. Oh, Sue, could you go back just a second? Thanks. I talked about that. Oh yeah, in Latin, if you didn't start the beginning Latin program in 3rd grade, then this would be the time to start it. If you did it in 3rd grade, then you can go on to beginning Latin 2. And we used to recommend the Memoria Press Latin, but we've moved to this Latin because it utilizes the students' particular gifts in this stage of formation, observation, memorizing, and sequencing by intention. And it does so in a way that prepares the student really well to do what's hardest in the more advanced Latin studies. My daughter developed this course, and she did it after teaching advanced Latin students. And she would say, Mom, I don't see why they're having such trouble here, you know? They didn't learn these particular things when they were younger, and it's causing them problems. So then she wrote a program where they are learning those particular things. So I've used the beginning Latin 1, beginning Latin 2, beginning Latin 3, fundamentals 1, and I recommend them all really highly. Okay, so now Sue, let's turn the page. Okay, in science we use Understanding God's World. Personally, I think this is the best of the Abeka science books. It comes originally from a Catholic book. One time I was buying used books and I was just looking for things. I picked up a book and I realized that it was fundamentally the same as Understanding God's World, but it was Catholic. So that's interesting. We moved in history to our Pioneers and Patriots and lots of supplementary texts. This is an event-driven study of history. The Pioneers and Patriots provides a framework. We find that it works really very well for the student. So we're using half of it in 4th grade and half of it in 5th grade. It is a Catholic book, and so it's nice because it incorporates the faith and the impact that the faith made in the founding of our country. Let's see. We use a geography workbook. This is just a reasonably laid out workbook, introduces map skills, and provides the student with independent work, which can be nice. There is additional information for memorization and designing your own classical curriculum, and then we also continue to work on the states and capitals. I love the drawing textbook. I haven't mentioned that before. I guess this is the first time that it's come up. But the drawing textbook is a book dedicated to the becoming literate with respect to drawing. So the person who wrote it, his contention is that everybody can learn to make an understandable visual, to express things visually. That's what I'm trying to say. Everybody can learn how to do that. What he does is teach the 7 laws of perspective, and he does it beautifully. He was the person who was involved, who was like the lead artist on Bambi, and you see it. It's beautifully drawn. That particular movie is beautifully drawn. It's before computer animation. And the drawing textbook is just it's a really good text for just teaching our children those basic principles. Yeah, and I'll say the same things about music. So I think we're good here, Sue. All right, so let's look at 5th grade. We're moving in 5th grade toward that more analytical stage of formation. So we are still working on observation, memory, and sequencing, but this is the last year in which that will be emphasized. Now, it's good to remember that all of this is ordered to improving the power of making those images and retaining them. So keep that in mind. But yeah, so this year is we're still working on that, but we are moving toward this analytical approach, right? The student is still memorizing poems, history facts, catechism questions. We have a more detailed list of geographical information in designing your own classical curriculum. He is still practicing observation and sequencing skills by retelling events from his history reading, both orally and in writing, and he's still using intermediate language lessons. If the child is having difficulty putting on paper what his reading is about, then I recommend that you have the student compose orally first. Let him tell you what he wants to say, and then he can write it down afterwards. I found this makes a huge difference. The work is easier because he's already composed the essay. He just has to remember what he said to you and put it on paper. And intermediate language lessons has some nice exercises of that kind. In writing, our writing program, which is integrated, as I've said before, into the other subjects, we focus on using paragraphs in papers in 5th grade. We want to make sure that each paragraph break corresponds to a proper topic change. And we want to make sure that each paragraph is about one thing. This is mentioned in that writing chart I pointed out to you before that's in our resource section. A secondary focus is the use of direct quotes. We want him to master direct quotes in 5th grade, both using them and correctly punctuating them. In science, when we're using concepts and challenges, we are practicing. It's good science because it's principle driven, but we also have this opportunity to answer questions at the end of every paragraph that are about the topic of the preceding paragraph. So they're providing analytic practice and experience with topic sentences, which is a focus for this year. And then also writing those answers consistently and neatly is an activity that the child can do entirely independently. And in 5th grade, you're really working toward the kids working independently. Okay, so we are going to look at the text, but I would like to just say a few things. Let's see. In history, there is an extensive supplemental reading list that supports the history textbook. Let's see. Yeah, we're working on people and events from the Revolutionary War through the Civil War. And the poetry selections this year complement the history. They supplement it. This is a really good time to begin a historical timeline if you haven't already done so. There's going to be lots of significant people and events that your children would benefit from putting on a visual timeline. The fine arts activities, both art and music, in 5th grade are really well suited to the stage of formation. The student has to observe or listen closely and attentively in order to complete the exercises. He has to hold the image in his mind in order to reproduce it or to compare it to another image. In both disciplines, there's an internal sequence required to produce the final product. And besides, it's just a good thing to continue to expose the student to beautiful art and music. Keep that practice of daily meeting times for discussions. They're important for all the reasons I gave earlier. You can review concepts in math, language arts. You can talk about what he's reading. He can practice his memorization. I just really urge you to have some one-on-one meeting time. If you have a lot of children, you might have to stagger that, some on one day, some on the next, back to the first group on the next day. You might have to do it, but try to work in daily conversational meeting times with your kids. Okay, let's look at the text, Sue. All right, we've talked about, the Baltimore Catechism number 2. Now, the main text in 5th grade is Credo, I Believe, which was written by Daria Saki, and it's really an excellent, very intelligently laid out discussion of the primary truths of our faith as revealed in the Apostles' Creed. And, my own experience is that students are ready at this point to consider the doctrine they've been presented with in the Baltimore Catechism kind of in another light, and this Faith and Life book gives them the opportunity to do so. Section 6.5 is just the next step. I like those Saxon books because they're cyclical in their methodology. Once a concept is learned, it's never forgotten because it's used regularly, and the explanations at this level are really quite good. A lot of our families are using teaching textbooks. That's fine. It's a good series too, but it is about a year behind. So in 5th grade, you would want to use teaching textbook 6. And in 6th grade, you would want to use teaching textbook 7. Okay? If you do that, then you will be at the right position for taking the SAT and the ACT when the time for that comes. Okay, we talked about intermediate language lessons, writing, road to reading, starting a spelling notebook. The poetry in this year is, again, in support of the history, just like it was. In Latin, we're moving on to beginning Latin 2 or beginning Latin 3, and as I said, I really like the beginning Latin program. So I think that's good. Let's look at the next. Okay, science, concepts and challenges. I talked about that already. I talked about the history. In geography, we use the Ultimate Geography and Timeline Guide if we have that as an option. We are also working on our own geography system. I just want to talk to you about it briefly. There were 2 things I really wanted for my children when we were doing geography. One was I wanted them to learn how to use real maps. So at the time when my kids were little, Continental Press had map books, but they were like hand-drawn sort of pseudo maps. And I just found that it didn't help the children very much when it came to reading a real map. So I've always preferred the map skills books where you were looking at real maps. And I really like something where you actually use an atlas, which the Ultimate Geography and Timeline Guide does encourage. So that's one thing. The other thing is there's this system of you want to learn how to observe a map closely. There's a lot of information on a map. So I used to have my children do something that called keyhole activities. I would take a piece of paper, cut out a circle. I would put that circle on a part of the map with some usually pretty recognizable feature. I would photocopy that so all the children saw was what was in that center. And as they got older, I would white out something within the center. Okay, I hope that's making sense. Anyway, then the kids would have to find the map that corresponded to that, what was in that center. So from looking at that little piece with close attention, then they'd have to go look at a map with close attention and find it, and then I would know that they'd succeeded because they would fill in whatever I had whited out. I thought it was a lot of fun. The kids enjoyed it. So I just want you to know that we're working on our own geography for 5th grade, which will have that. But so the general key here is we want the kids to use real maps, and we want them to develop their observational skills. And the Ultimate Geography and Timeline Guide does that, and when we have our own geography program universally available, we do have it in a beta version now. I think you'll like it. We talked about the drawing textbook. Art 5 is beautiful pictures in our own art book. You will like those pictures. In music, we use Alfred's Essentials for music, which is a very well-known and excellent text teaching theory. It's actually, this is one time when, even if you're using an instrument, this is a good resource. It's reinforcing and not too teacher intensive. It fits with our general mode of procedure because it works on helping students understand principles and then apply them. The students will develop music appreciation through listening to the classical music selections that they listen to, which there are suggestions for those in their syllabus. Okay, so I think that more or less covers all of the texts. Okay, and when we have our time together, if there's something in what I said that's not perfectly clear, please ask about it. When it doesn't work, what do you do? So I'd like to just finish up with this because, I've worked with a lot of families over the years, and sometimes, especially at the beginning of the year, a mom will say to me, "This just isn't working. I want to try something else." And listen, I've been there. I used to, I used to switch programs out a lot, and then I realized it wasn't good for the kids, and so I developed a rule, which was really switch only at the end of the year, occasionally switch at the semester, but generally finish what you start. Because everything has its own internal order, and if you're messing around with, I did the first third of this and I did the second third of that, well, there may have been things in the first third of the second thing that weren't covered in the first third of the first thing, and there can be things that you just entirely miss. So when I'm working with a mom, I encourage her to, before she changes a text, to first look at the environment. Things aren't working. Okay, well, let's talk about, yes, where the student is doing school. Is it in a noisy place? Is he having trouble focusing? Is the television on? Is he sitting in front of a window where there's a lot of activity? Those kinds of things. Maybe that's why it's not working. But I also think about things like this. What kind of sleep is he getting? What kind of sleep are you getting? Is he eating well? Pay attention to the day. When does he work well? Analyze the external situation before you change the text, because sometimes just making sure that they get more sleep, or making sure that they're doing math like right after breakfast, or that realizing that reading done immediately after lunch is really soporific, they'll just go to sleep, so that's not a good time to have the directed reading, or that's not a good time to read the science, or something like that. Think about those external things before you change the text. Also, you can break the formation goal down into smaller tasks. So once you recognize that there are formation goals, like in the Father Schuster book, which, like I said, it's harder, and I recognize that. But we're working on, the sequencing, the skill of sequencing. Okay, just like when the kids were in kindergarten, if they, initially were having trouble with the children's Bible, I would say, keep reading it, but pick 3 things and ask the child to sequence those. You're still achieving the goal, you've just broken it down. Same thing here. Maybe the thing to do with Father Schuster is read less, because sometimes we have them read quite a lot. Maybe instead of reading 3 chapters, they should read 1. Maybe you could give specific points and have the child include those points in his retelling, rather than trying to figure out what all to include. Try to see what you could do to facilitate this activity with this book by isolating what the goal is and meeting that goal in a gentler way, for a while anyway. See if that doesn't help. Sometimes, a mom says, he just cannot write about this book. Okay, well, mom knows if he can't, he can't. Well, then maybe we'll do our sequencing somewhere else. Maybe we'll, try to do it in the science or in literature, retell that story. But there is this benefit to using that Father Schuster book or some other material, that stretching of the language. Even if it's hard, but it can be done, then I think it's worth doing. And maybe you're going to separate your formation goals. Here you're developing patterns of language, but you're not also going to work on the sequencing. You'll do that somewhere else. That's another way to deal with a problem. And finally, if you say, no, he just can't do this, he can't read this text, okay, well, then we should change it. Sometimes I have people go back to the Bishop Neck book and just continue on where they left off the previous year. You could do that, but then make sure that you're meeting the formation goals, all of them, in elsewhere. You might then meet the sequencing goal here, but you're going to want to make sure that he reads something that's a little more challenging, at least, so that he develops that sense of the patterns of language in another area. Okay, ladies, well, I know that was kind of long, but I hope it's helpful to you. Thank you for joining me. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Laura. That was wonderful.